The Secret of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks, Chapter 15, Interrogation. Mr. Johnson kept his hand on Omri's shoulder all the way to his office, as if he thought Omri would twist free and run for it if he didn't hold on to him. And he might have done it, too, if he hadn't been half paralyzed, at least mentally, from apprehension. He knows. Those were the only words in Omri's head. What was he to do when the interrogation began, as it would in a matter of moments? Lie, deny everything, okay, but what if? Mr. Johnson thrust him through the door of his office, followed him in, and closed and locked it behind him. Then he walked behind his desk. But he didn't sit down. He leaned forward and rested his knuckles on the desk, and gazed, and glared hypnotically into Omri's eyes. "Now, Omri," he said in a clear, deep voice, which he used on the most solemn occasions when someone had done something expulsion-worthy. "You know what I have to say." Omri swallowed and stared at him the way a rabbit stares into a car's headlights as they bear down on him. "You haven't forgotten that day last year," he said, "any more than I have. The day you and Patrick were sent to my office for talking in class. The day I went home early because I supposed I was ill, having seen something I believed I couldn't possibly have seen. You remember all that, Omri, don't you?" Omri felt his head nod. "What I thought I saw," the headmaster continued slowly, "was two tiny living people in the palm of a boy's hand. They moved. One of them was dressed as a Red Indian." "It's not right to say Red Indian," Omri heard himself say in a strangled voice. Mr. Johnson jerked his head back. "I beg your pardon. They don't like it." Omri pursued helplessly, hardly knowing what he was saying. "You should say American Indian or Native American." "I have always said Red Indian, and I shall continue to say Red Indian," Mr. Johnson was suddenly shouting. "I say I saw a Red Indian, a tiny little one, and another figure as well, and they were alive, and I spent weeks trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen them, that I'd been overworking, and in the end I did convince myself, almost, until this morning when I heard you read your story," he went on, leaning closer so that Omri backed up a step. "It all came back to me in a flash, and I knew I was not imagining things after all. I ought to have had more faith in my strength of mind. I ought to have known I am not a man to imagine things." His voice dropped and his shoulders slumped. "I must confess, it's a relief in a way. That's what it is, a relief." He took a deep breath and allowed himself to sit down. Omri was standing in front of the desk. His knees had gone woolly, and his face felt cold. "Now then, my boy," said Mr. Johnson more calmly, "let us take a new starting point. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio." "Who?" croaked Omri. "As Shakespeare says, I saw what I saw. They were real. They are real. That is the truth, is it not?" Omri stood dumb. He shut his mouth on lies and truth alike, just stood there silent. Mr. Johnson was thinking. A year ago, on the day in question, he had browbeaten Patrick into showing him the little people by means of a threat, a telephone to telephone Patrick's father. It had worked then. Perhaps it would work now. "Omri, if you will not tell me what I wish to know, I shall have to get your parents' cooperation." Omri leaped to the telephone. His mind, numb before, suddenly burst into activity. He had not locked his bedroom door because he couldn't. It only bolted from the inside. The cupboard was there. Boone was there. Matron was there. And so were a number of Indians, unprotected and alone, not to mention Patrick in a deep coma inside of the chest. If Mr. Johnson phoned home, his mother or his father would answer, and the first thing they would do was go up in his room, if they believed it. But they wouldn't. How could they? Looking at Mr. Johnson, Omri saw the same thought come into his mind. Mr. Johnson was not a man who enjoyed looking like a fool. "Go ahead and phone them," Omri said. The trap shifted. It was not Omri who was caught in it now. Mr. Johnson drummed with his fingers on the desk, looking at the phone inwardly, rehearsing the conversation. No, he must get the boy to admit the truth first. But how? Just at that critical moment, fate intervened. The phone they both were staring at began to ring. They jumped. Mr. Johnson, recovering himself, answered. "Hello? Yes, the headmaster here." He listened and his face changed. His eyes flashed to Omri and his eyebrows went up. Yes, he is. He's with me now as it happens. He covered the phone with his hand and said grimly, It's your mother. What does she want? He didn't answer, just handed the receiver to Omri. Mum? Omri? Where's Patrick? Omri's heart plummeted to new depths in his chest. Patrick? Yes, darling, where is he? I've got his mother here, frantic. Emma's with her. His mother lowered her voice. She's crying. Apparently she told Patrick's mother that he was spending the night with us, whereas of course he didn't. Now come on, out with it. Where is he? I'm not sure, stammered Omri, which wasn't precisely a lie. There was silence from the other end. Then, Omri, let me speak to Mr. Johnson. Dumbly, Omri handed the phone back and listened, as well as he could, with the blood still pounding in his ears. Yes, Johnson here. Yes, I see, yes. I remember Patrick very well. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion as he looked at Omri. You want Omri to come home? No problem about that, he said smoothly. In fact, I'll bring him myself. Oh, no, cried Omri before he could restrain himself. Oh, yes, said Mr. Johnson. He hung up the phone deliberately and rose to his feet. Come along, my boy. Ahem. Portia's outside. You can direct me. Omri directed him to his house. What else could he do? His mind was racing ahead. Patrick's mother, his own mother, probably his father, and now Mr. Johnson. They would all be there, all going at him, going at Emma, breaking down their resistance. All he could think, by way of consolation, was, thank goodness I sent Little Bear Bright Stars and the baby safely back. The figures were still in his pocket. Mr. Johnson parked his nice new Porsche, part of an inheritance, it was rumored, outside the house under the big old elm tree that had died in the Dutch elm disease epidemic some years before, but hadn't yet been cut down. It was a good climbing tree, and Omri, in his imagination, shinnied straight up to the top of it in a trice. If only he could be there on that branch just above his attic bedroom skylight, he might manage to climb in, bolt the door, get all the little people safely in the cupboard, restore Patrick all before anyone could get there by the usual route. If only, but Mr. Johnson's hand was back like a steel vice on his shoulder. The front door was opening even before they reached it, and there they all were, waiting for Omri to explain. And that is the end of Chapter 15.